Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a high school English teacher from Portland, and I genuinely believed that families were supposed to support each other through thick and thin. But at my sister Emma's wedding last October, I learned just how wrong I could be about the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The morning started like any other wedding day. I'd driven 4 hours from Portland to our hometown of Bend, Oregon, carrying the bridesmaid dress Emma had specifically chosen for me, a pale lavender number that, honestly, made me look like I was attending a funeral rather than celebrating love. But I wore it with a smile because this was Emma's day, and despite our complicated relationship, I wanted nothing more than to see her happy. I should have known something was off when I arrived at the bridal suite and found myself relegated to the corner chair, the one facing away from the mirror where all the other bridesmaids were getting their hair and makeup done. Emma's college friends chatted and laughed while the makeup artist worked her magic on each of them. When my turn finally came, Emma glanced over and said, "Just keep it simple for Sarah. Natural look, you know?" The makeup artist nodded and gave me what could barely be called a touch-up, but I brushed it off. Emma was stressed, I told myself. Brides get to be a little demanding on their wedding day. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Emma looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, and her fiancé James seemed genuinely smitten as she walked down the aisle. I stood with the other bridesmaids, holding my bouquet of white roses and baby's breath, trying to ignore the way my mother kept glancing at me with that familiar expression of barely concealed disappointment. It was during the reception that everything fell apart. Emma had insisted on giving a speech before dinner was served. She stood up, champagne flute in hand, her cheeks flushed with happiness and maybe a little too much pre-dinner wine. "I want to thank everyone for being here on the most important day of my life," she began, and I felt myself tearing up because despite everything, I was genuinely happy for her. "You know," Emma continued, her voice carrying across the reception hall, "they say some people are born to marry rich." She paused, looking directly at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And some are born to raise mistakes." The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people listening to a heartfelt speech, but the uncomfortable silence that falls when everyone realizes they're witnessing something they shouldn't be seeing. I felt my face burning with embarrassment, but I kept my smile frozen in place. This had to be some kind of joke I wasn't getting. Emma wouldn't really humiliate me in front of 150 wedding guests, would she? But then my mother stood up from the head table, her own champagne glass raised. "Well," she said with a laugh that sounded more like a bark, "at least her mistake wore shoes this time." The laughter that followed wasn't universal, but it was loud enough. Loud enough to make it clear that this wasn't some misunderstood attempt at sisterly teasing. This was deliberate. This was planned. And this was my family publicly declaring that I was the family embarrassment. I sat there, still holding my champagne glass, watching my sister and mother toast to my humiliation, while wedding guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some laughed along, probably unsure of what else to do. Others stared down at their plates, clearly embarrassed for me. That's when James stood up. Emma's new husband, a man I'd met exactly 3 times before this wedding, slowly rose from his seat at the head table. The laughter died down as everyone turned to look at him, probably expecting him to add his own roast to the pile. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "Sarah, I've heard so many stories about how you helped Emma through college when your parents couldn't afford her tuition, how you worked 2 jobs so she could focus on her studies, how you've been the one person in this family who's always put everyone else first." The room was dead silent now. "I think," James continued, his voice steady and clear, "that makes you anything but a mistake, and I'm honored to have you as a sister-in-law." He raised his glass toward me, and I felt something crack open in my chest. Relief, gratitude, and a pain so sharp it nearly took my breath away. Because here was someone who barely knew me, standing up for me in a way my own family never had. But the damage was done. As James sat back down and Emma's face flushed an angry red, I realized that this moment, this public humiliation disguised as wedding humor, was just the latest in a pattern that had been building my entire life. I excused myself from the table, mumbling something about needing air, and walked out onto the venue's back patio. The October evening was crisp, and I wrapped my arms around myself trying to process what had just happened. Behind me, I could hear the reception continuing, the clinking of silverware on plates, the gradual return of conversation and laughter, life moving on as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just been publicly branded as the family disappointment in front of everyone who mattered to my sister. I pulled out my phone and stared at it, trying to decide who to call. My college roommate? My work friend Katie? But what would I even say? Hey, guess what? My family thinks I'm such a loser that they decided to announce it at my sister's wedding? That's when Emma appeared beside me, still holding her champagne glass. Oh, come on, Sarah, she said, her voice taking on that sing-song tone she'd used since we were kids whenever she was about to tell me I was overreacting. It was just a joke. Why do you always have to make everything so dramatic? I turned to look at her. Really look at her. My younger sister, who I'd helped raise when our parents were working multiple jobs, who I'd tutored through high school math and driven to college visits because Mom and Dad couldn't take time off work, who I'd lent money to for her security deposit on her first apartment and never asked to be paid back. A joke? I repeated. Yes, a joke. God, you're so sensitive. This is exactly why Mom and I were talking about how you always make everything about yourself. And there it was, the gaslighting that I'd been subjected to my entire life, dressed up in wedding finery and delivered with a smile. You and Mom were talking about me? I asked. Emma waved her hand dismissively. Just about how you never seem to get your life together. I mean, you're 32 and you're still teaching high school. When are you going to do something real with your life? Something real. As if educating teenagers wasn't real. As if the thank you notes I got from former students who'd gone on to college wasn't real. As if the extra hours I spent tutoring kids who couldn't afford private help wasn't real. I see, I said quietly. Look, I'm sorry if your feelings got hurt, but tonight is about me and James. Can't you just be happy for me for once instead of making this all about your drama? I stared at my sister, this woman who I'd sacrificed for, supported and loved unconditionally for 3 decades, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. You're absolutely right, I told her. Tonight is about you, and tomorrow, and every day after that, will be about me figuring out exactly who I am when I stop letting this family define me. Emma blinked, clearly not expecting that response. What's that supposed to mean? But I was already walking back toward the reception hall, not to rejoin the party, but to collect my purse and car keys. As I made my way through the reception, I caught sight of my mother at the head table, holding court with some of the older relatives. She saw me approaching and actually smiled, probably thinking I was coming back to play my usual role, the good daughter who swallows her hurt and pretends everything is fine. Instead, I stopped at her table and leaned down close enough that only she could hear me. 32 years, I said quietly. 32 years I've been waiting for you to be proud of me, to defend me, to love me the way a mother should love her daughter. My mother's smile faltered. I'm done waiting, I continued, and I'm done pretending that this family's treatment of me is normal or acceptable. I straightened up, kissed her cheek the way I had after every family dinner and holiday gathering for my entire adult life, and walked away. The drive back to Portland was a blur of headlights and highway lines, but by the time I pulled into my apartment complex at nearly midnight, something had crystallized in my mind. This wasn't just about a wedding speech or a moment of public humiliation. This was about a lifetime of being treated as less than, of being the family scapegoat, of being expected to give and give and give while receiving nothing but criticism and dismissal in return. I sat in my car for a long time that night, engine off, staring up at my apartment building. Somewhere up there was my quiet, modest life, my books and my lesson plans and my small circle of friends who actually valued me. It wasn't glamorous by Emma and my mother's standards, but it was mine, and maybe it was time I started protecting it. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Most were from Emma, ranging from angry to pleading to confused. A few were from my mother, each one a masterclass in emotional manipulation disguised as concern. "Sarah, honey, you left so abruptly last night. Emma is devastated that you couldn't just let her have her special day." "I don't understand why you're being so dramatic about a little harmless teasing." "Your sister is crying. Is that what you wanted?" I read through each message carefully, and for the first time in my life, I saw them for what they really were. Not expressions of love or concern, but attempts to pull me back into my assigned role as the family disappointment who was supposed to take whatever treatment they dished out and smile while doing it. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and began to type a response. Not to the individual messages, but to the group chat that had included my mother, Emma, and me for the past 5 years. "I need some time to process what happened last night. I won't be attending family gatherings for the foreseeable future. Please respect my need for space." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The response was immediate and predictable. My phone started buzzing with calls that I didn't answer and texts that I didn't read. Because for the first time in my adult life, I was putting my own emotional well-being first. But even as I felt a strange sense of relief at having finally stood up for myself, I couldn't shake the image of that moment at the reception. The moment when James had stood up for me while my own family sat there, comfortable in their cruelty. It made me wonder, if a stranger could see my worth so clearly, why couldn't the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally? And more importantly, what else about my family's treatment of me had I been accepting as normal when it was anything but? That afternoon, I found myself pulling out photo albums I hadn't looked at in years, pictures of family vacations where I was always the one taking the photos, rarely in them. Christmas mornings where Emma's pile of presents dwarfed mine, year after year. Graduation photos where my parents looked proud of Emma's communications degree but barely managed a smile for my education degree. And there, tucked between pages of family memories, I found something I'd forgotten about entirely. A small silver bracelet my grandmother had given me before she died. She'd pressed it into my hand during her final hospital stay and whispered, "This is for my brave girl, the one who always takes care of everyone else." I'd worn it every day for a year after her death, but somewhere along the way, I'd stopped. Probably because my mother had made some comment about it being too flashy or inappropriate for a teacher. I fastened the bracelet around my wrist and felt something settle into place. My grandmother had seen me, really seen me, and she'd wanted me to remember that I was brave, that I was worthy of being taken care of too. That bracelet would become my anchor in the weeks that followed, a tangible reminder that at least one person in my family had loved me exactly as I was. Because I was about to discover just how deep the rabbit hole of my family's dysfunction really went, and how much of my life I'd been living according to rules designed to keep me small, grateful, and invisible. The wedding had been just the beginning. The weeks following Emma's wedding passed in a strange kind of peace. I'd blocked both my mother and sister on social media, ignored their increasingly frantic phone calls, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But that peace was shattered on a Tuesday evening in November when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Sarah, this is James, Emma's husband." I almost hung up, assuming he was calling on Emma's behalf to guilt me into reconciling, but something in his tone stopped me. "I need to talk to you," he said, "about things that happened before the wedding, things Emma and your mother don't know I overheard." We met at a coffee shop in downtown Portland the next evening. James looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his wedding ring as he spoke. "The night before the wedding," he began. "I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs to get some water. Emma and your mother were in the kitchen, and they were planning what happened at the reception." My stomach dropped. "Planning?" "They called it putting Sarah in her place. Your mother said something about how you'd been getting too confident lately and needed to be reminded of where you stood in the family hierarchy." James's face was pale. "Emma laughed and said the wedding would be the perfect opportunity because you couldn't make a scene without ruining her special day." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too warm. I gripped my grandmother's bracelet, feeling the silver warm under my fingers. "There's more," James continued. They talked about other things, about how they've been managing your relationships over the years. What do you mean, managing? James pulled out his phone and showed me a screenshot. It was a Facebook conversation between Emma and someone named Derek, my ex-boyfriend from 3 years ago. Emma reached out to him after you two broke up, James explained. She told him you were emotionally unstable and that he'd dodged a bullet. She did the same thing with at least 2 other guys you dated. I stared at the screen, reading Emma's messages to Derek. Trust me, you're better off without Sarah. She's always been the dramatic one in our family. Mom and I have been dealing with her issues for years. How did you get this? I whispered. Derek's my cousin. He showed me these messages last month because he felt guilty about believing them. He said you were the kindest person he'd ever dated, and he never understood why he'd listened to Emma. The room was spinning. 3 years I'd wondered why Derek had suddenly become cold and distant. 3 years I'd blamed myself for yet another failed relationship. James, why are you telling me this? He leaned forward, his expression serious. Because I've been watching Emma with her friends, and I'm starting to see patterns. The way she talks about people, the way she manipulates situations to make herself look better, and your mother enables all of it. I need copies of everything, I said. Over the next 2 weeks, James became an unlikely ally. He provided screenshots, recorded conversations, and insights into my family's behavior that I'd been too close to see clearly. Each piece of evidence was like a puzzle piece clicking into place, revealing a picture I'd been blind to my entire life. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to reach out to my childhood friend, Mrs. Patterson, who had taught at my elementary school. She was retired now, living in the same small house where she'd hosted countless sleepovers and homework sessions during my childhood. Sarah! She exclaimed when I knocked on her door. I was wondering when you'd come by. I heard about Emma's wedding. We sat in her familiar living room, surrounded by photos of former students and the same floral wallpaper I remembered from 20 years ago. Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you about something from when I was little? About my family? Her expression grew serious. What would you like to know, sweetheart? Was I really as difficult as my mother always said I was? Because I'm starting to wonder if my memories of my childhood are accurate. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, then got up and walked to an old filing cabinet in the corner. She pulled out a thick folder and returned to her seat. I kept these, she said, opening the folder to reveal dozens of school reports, notes, and drawings. I probably shouldn't have, but something told me they might be important someday. She handed me a report card from 2nd grade. In the comments section, my teacher had written, Sarah is an exceptional student and a natural leader. She consistently helps struggling classmates and shows remarkable emotional maturity for her age. However, I'm concerned about some of the language she uses when describing herself. She frequently calls herself stupid and a burden, which doesn't align with her actual performance or behavior. I stared at the report card, remembering how my mother had grounded me for a week because of the teacher's concerns about my attitude. There's more, Mrs. Patterson said gently. She showed me note after note from teachers expressing worry about my self-esteem, my tendency to apologize for things that weren't my fault, and my habit of taking responsibility for my younger sister's behavior. Sarah, your teachers were concerned because you displayed classic signs of a child who was being emotionally parentified. You were 7 years old and already acting like you were responsible for everyone else's happiness. The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought about all those years of being told I was too sensitive when I cried, too dramatic when I expressed hurt, too needy when I asked for attention. Why didn't anyone say anything? I asked. We tried. Your mother was very good at explaining everything away. She had an answer for every concern, and back then, we didn't have the same understanding of emotional abuse that we do now. Mrs. Patterson pulled out one more item, a drawing I'd made in 3rd grade. It showed a family of stick figures, but one figure was noticeably smaller and positioned away from the others. At the bottom, in my 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, I wish I could be good enough. I broke down crying right there in Mrs. Patterson's living room, mourning not just for the adult I'd become, but for the little girl who'd spent her entire childhood believing she was fundamentally flawed. That night, I began documenting everything, every memory, every incident, every pattern of behavior that I'd previously dismissed as normal family dynamics. I created a timeline, starting from my earliest memories and working forward to the wedding. The picture that emerged was devastating and clear. I had been systematically trained to be the family scapegoat, the emotional dumping ground, the person who absorbed all the dysfunction so that Emma could be the golden child, and my parents could maintain their image as a perfect family. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed to understand the full extent of what had been done to me, and more importantly, I needed to make sure it never happened again. I started with financial records. If my family had been sabotaging my relationships, what else had they been controlling? I requested copies of my credit report and was shocked to discover 3 credit cards I'd never opened, all with significant balances. The cards had been opened using my social security number and a P.O. box I'd never heard of, but the shipping address for the physical cards was my mother's house. When I called the credit card companies, I learned that the cards had been used for purchases at stores my mother and Emma frequented. Nordstrom, Williams-Sonoma, expensive restaurants in their town. They'd been using my credit for years, counting on the fact that I never checked my credit report. The total debt in my name was over $30,000. I filed police reports for identity theft, froze my credit, and hired a lawyer to help me navigate the process of proving fraud. But more than the money, I was furious about the assumption that I would never find out, never fight back, never demand accountability. They had underestimated me my entire life, and I was done being underestimated. The next phase of my investigation focused on family finances. If they were comfortable stealing from me, what else were they hiding? I remembered that my grandmother had left a small inheritance when she died, money that my mother had claimed was mostly used for funeral expenses, with only a tiny amount left for Emma and me. I drove to the county clerk's office and requested copies of my grandmother's will and estate documents. What I found made my hands shake with rage. My grandmother had left her house and $200,000 in savings to be split equally between Emma and me. According to the documents, Emma had received her full inheritance at age 25, but my portion had been placed in a trust, with my mother as the trustee, to be released when I turned 30. I had turned 32 6 months ago, and I'd never heard a word about any trust fund. Further investigation revealed that my mother had been using trust funds to pay for Emma's wedding, her down payment on her house, and countless other expenses over the years. My inheritance had been systematically drained to fund my sister's lifestyle while I struggled to pay my bills on a teacher's salary. I sat in my car outside the clerk's office, staring at the documents in my lap, and felt something cold and determined settle in my chest. This wasn't just family dysfunction or emotional abuse anymore. This was theft, fraud, and years of systematic financial exploitation. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Sarah, Mom is worried sick about you. When are you going to stop this childish, silent treatment?" For the first time since the wedding, I responded, "I'll be in touch soon. We have a lot to discuss." I drove straight to my lawyer's office and laid out everything I'd discovered. The credit card fraud, the stolen inheritance, the documented history of emotional manipulation. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca Chen, listened carefully and took notes. "Sarah," she said when I finished, "you have grounds for both criminal charges and civil litigation. This level of financial abuse, especially involving a trust fund, is serious business." "What are my options?" "We can start with a demand letter, requiring full restitution of your inheritance plus interest and immediate cessation of all fraudulent accounts. If they don't comply, we move to criminal charges and a civil lawsuit." I thought about my grandmother's bracelet, about Mrs. Patterson's files, about all the years I'd been made to feel like I was the problem. "Do it," I said, "all of it." That evening, I sat down and wrote letters to my extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins who had been at the wedding and witnessed my humiliation. But instead of asking for sympathy or support, I simply told them the truth. I told them about the credit card fraud, the stolen inheritance, and the years of manipulation. I attached copies of documents, screenshots of conversations, and links to resources about emotional abuse and financial exploitation. I wasn't asking anyone to choose sides. I was simply providing information and letting them draw their own conclusions. The responses came quickly and were more supportive than I'd expected. My father's sister called me within hours, crying as she apologized for not seeing what was happening. "I always wondered why you seemed so sad at family gatherings," she said, "but your mother was so good at explaining everything away." My cousin Jennifer drove down from Seattle the next weekend just to give me a hug and tell me she'd always thought my mother treated me unfairly but hadn't known how to help. But the most significant response came from my Uncle Tom, my mother's brother, who had always been the family's moral compass. "Sarah," he said over the phone, "I need you to know that your grandmother specifically told me she was leaving you that money because she was worried about how your mother treated you. She made me promise to check on you after she died, and I failed you. I'm so sorry." Uncle Tom, you couldn't have known. I should have asked more questions, and I should have told you years ago that your grandmother was concerned about your mother's favoritism toward Emma. He paused, then continued. "There's something else you should know. Your grandmother left you a letter. It was supposed to be given to you when you received your inheritance." "What letter?" "Your mother said she'd given it to you. When you told me you never received it, I realized she'd been lying about more than just the money." We arranged to meet the following weekend, and Uncle Tom handed me an envelope that had been sealed for over 6 years. Inside was a letter in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then you've received your inheritance and hopefully begun to understand how much you were loved and valued, even when others couldn't see it. I'm leaving you this money not because you need it, but because you deserve to have choices. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Now I want you to take care of yourself. You are not a mistake, sweetheart. You are not too much or too sensitive or too anything. You are exactly who you were meant to be, and I am so proud of the woman you've become. Use this money to build a life that makes you happy, and don't let anyone make you feel guilty for putting yourself first. Love always, Grandma Rose." I sat in Uncle Tom's driveway and sobbed, mourning not just for my grandmother, but for all the years I'd lived without knowing that someone had seen my worth and planned for my future. But grief was quickly replaced by determination. My grandmother had wanted me to have choices, to build a life that made me happy. And the first choice I needed to make was whether to let my family continue their pattern of abuse or to finally, definitively, put an end to it. I called Rebecca Chin that night and told her to proceed with criminal charges. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Once we file these charges, there's no going back. Your relationship with your family will be permanently altered." I looked down at my grandmother's bracelet, thought about the letter hidden from me for 6 years, and felt a clarity I'd never experienced before. "There's no relationship to save," I said. "There never really was." The demand letter was delivered to my mother's house on a Tuesday morning in December. It outlined exactly what we knew about the fraudulent credit cards and the stolen inheritance, demanded full restitution within 30 days, and made it clear that criminal charges would follow if our demands weren't met. My mother called within an hour, her voice shaking with what I initially thought was fear, but quickly recognized as rage. "How dare you!" she screamed into the phone. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By trying to destroy your own family?" For 32 years, that tone of voice had made me crumble, made me apologize, made me question my own perception of reality. But sitting in my apartment with my grandmother's letter on the table beside me, I felt nothing but cold resolve. "Everything you've done for me," I repeated. "You mean stealing my inheritance? Opening credit cards in my name? Sabotaging my relationships? Which of those things were done for me, exactly?" "You don't understand the sacrifices we made?" "No," I interrupted. "You don't understand the sacrifices I made. And you certainly don't understand that I'm done making them." I hung up the phone and turned off the ringer. The next morning, Emma showed up at my apartment building, buzzing my intercom repeatedly until I finally answered. "Sarah, please, you have to stop this insanity. Do you want to destroy our family over money?" I looked down at her through my window, this woman who had been my sister, my responsibility, my burden for so many years. "Emma," I said through the intercom, The family was destroyed a long time ago. I'm just finally done pretending it wasn't. 3 days before the deadline in our demand letter, Rebecca Chen called with an update. "They want to meet," she said. "Your mother's lawyer is requesting a settlement conference." What does that mean? It means they're scared and they want to negotiate, which tells me they know we have them dead to rights on the financial fraud. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, just days before Christmas. As I prepared for what would likely be the final confrontation with my family, I thought about the woman I'd been at Emma's wedding just 2 months earlier. Someone who would have accepted the humiliation, swallowed the pain, and continued pretending that being the family scapegoat was normal and acceptable. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who understood her worth, who had documentation to prove years of abuse, and who had finally learned the difference between love and manipulation. I was ready for whatever came next.